Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Rachel Ball
Hello.
and Alex Fairlamb.
Yeah.
Excellent to have you both here to talk about the theme of scaffolding. And I know we're going to get into it soon, but first, Rachel, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
I have just recently finished Josh Goodrich's book, Responsive Coaching, which is very pertinent to my role at Step Lab at the moment. But this book has really made me think about how coaching is incredibly complex, and we really need to be responsive as coaches to the needs of the teachers that we're coaching. So the idea is we're thinking about a teacher's what their insights are, what their awareness is of what's going on in the classroom, and asking questions around that whenever we're diagnosing and then setting an action step for a teacher. Absolutely brilliant read, particularly for anyone who's looking to implement coaching in the future.
I really enjoy reading. I read a lot of kind of history fiction books, but then I also read a lot of pedagogy books as well, because I think it's a great way to kind of keep abreast of everything that's happening in current thinking. So I've just literally today finished Why Does Learning Fail by Alex Quigley. And it's a really accessible text in terms of kind of identifying the different reasons why learning fails, but then also what you can do about it. And it's got these really kind of cute summaries. I can't believe I called it cute, but yeah, little cute summaries. But it's a lot of common sense, but then a lot of like how he phrases things. So it's looking at planning failures as well. So why it is that when we're setting homework, we've really got to think about the steps that a child takes in order to actually then embark on that homework. But it can really be applied to things like writing and kind of reading as well. So it's about 7 or 8 different reasons why learning fails. And I think it's something which can be easily used in both primary and secondary, because, as I said, it does talk about the writing process, it does talk about approaches to homework, but it also talks about overconfidence and how we can mitigate against overconfidence. And I just really like how plain speaking he is, because I think we've all sat through kind of a motivational assembly in the build up to year 11, and he's basically said that's a load of tosh. We shouldn't be doing that. And I just think, yeah, so yeah, it's full of evidence and really practical strategy. So yeah, fully recommend it.
What are you reading for?
What are you reading for?
Yeah, so I've started a book by, is it Mary Beard? It's called SPQR, about the Romans. And
Very good.
so you've already read it, have you?
Two historians in the room.
I mean, that does make total sense. I quite like reading history in my spare time. But I've been on sort of antiquity, late antiquity drive at the minute. I finished Tom Holland's on The Shadow of the Sword, which sort of looks at 400 to about just at the end of the 700s. And so now I've gone in for this one, see if I can build up that picture. But I think it's I think it's accessible.
I think she's an absolute legend. I love her book, Women in Power, and how she unpicks kind of modern misogyny and how it's linked to kind of how we've seen it over the past. And she was at the Historical Association conference last year. She was the keynote, and she was absolutely amazing. Yeah, there's a photo of me and Rachel with her, and she's giving us the big thumbs up. So
I mean, fair play to her. Yeah, she writes really well. I enjoyed her reading her work. So yeah, more power to her. The focus of this episode is going to be scaffolding. Rachel, you joined me not so long ago, but still quite a while ago, to discuss sort of school improvement in general. Alex, this is your first time in the podcast. I wonder if you might provide us with a bit of background, where you're from and how you got to where you are today.
So I live up in the Northeast. I'm an assistant principal of teaching and learning and secondary literacy. I'm an SLE and an ELE, which just means lots of acronyms, really. And I'm on the secondary committee of the Historical Association and Steering Board of School Northeast. And I also facilitate for Ambition Institute MPQLL. So I've co-edited a book with Rachel, What is History Teaching Now? And we're currently working on our most recent project, which is the Scaffolding Effect, which is for the Inner Drive series for Routledge. So that's pretty much read into that massive history geek and loves the literacy as well as teaching and learning.
Fantastic. And you're both regulars on the Research Ed circuit, which is sort of I came into my sort of peripheral vision, so to speak. And I know that people always speak very highly of your talks, certainly on social media, but also in just normal conversations as well. I think it makes sense to begin with definitions. And my first question is, what is scaffolding / what is scaffolding not?
I mean, this is like my whole presentation at Research Ed is basically answering this question. So to do it in a succinct way is pretty difficult. I think probably the first place to start with is why do we need scaffolding, and what are we talking about when we talk about scaffolding? I think it starts with the idea of teach the top. And as a profession, I think we've realised over the last few years about how important challenge is in the classroom, and how we shouldn't be dumbing down for students, and thinking about just thinking about all our planning and our curriculum planning, and aiming our pitch of the lesson for the very top of the ability. But then the problem comes with that when you do that, you need to then scaffold up so that all learners can then reach that high standard. I think the big mix-up in education can be thinking that scaffolding represents differentiation. And for us, a big part of our book and my talk is about how scaffolding is not differentiation. If you think about differentiation being predetermining what students are going to do, scaffolding is about the live adaptations that take place in the lesson. So you might in advance think about the barriers that might exist within a particular lesson. And then scaffolding would be the adaptations that you make within the lesson. So just as a short exemplification, let's say that you were reading a challenging text with a group of students. So you're pitching high, you're teaching to the top with your choice of text, but you're not going to dumb down that text. You want all students to then read it together. So how can you then scaffold and support? Well, you might preempt in advance of the lesson what words students might find challenging and define those really clearly. You might provide a glossary, you might stop and question around those words and make sure students really understand what they mean. And then from the reading, you might then set some questions that you then scaffold for some learners or for all learners, depending on how much prior knowledge they've got. If you start a new exam topic with a class, they're all going to need scaffolding at the beginning, and that scaffolding can take lots and lots of different forms. I think there's a big misconception that scaffolding is just a writing frame or an extra worksheet, and one of the things we're doing in our book is really challenging that. The EF they give us some really good guidance. They say that scaffolding can be visual, verbal, or written. So scaffolding could be a nudge to a student, well, how did you tackle this question last time? Or it could be a diagram on the board that reminds students of the procedure they need to use whenever they're completing a particular equation. All of those things can be scaffolding in their own form. But yeah, I think the biggest misconception is that scaffolding is just making the work easier, and that's a big misconception that particularly novice teachers have. So that's something we try and challenge. Within a definition, I'll let you talk in a second, sorry Alex. In terms of a definition, I do think the analogy of stabilizers on a bike is a really good way of looking at it. Scaffolding is always about temporary support. So a child who's learning to ride a bike will not have stabilizers for the rest of their lives. At some point you're going to remove them as a parent teaching your child. And in the same way as teachers, we need to remove scaffolding at the appropriate point so that students can have that challenge and have that independent work.
Yeah, I think building on what Rachel has comprehensively covered, I think a big part of it is, as she said, it's got to be reduced over time. So a big part of scaffolding is also ensuring that you're doing a lot of modelling so that over time that metacognition kicks in so that you can reduce that scaffolding. So I talked before about Alex Quigley's book and how he talks about success criteria and things like that. So how with effective metacognitive oracy, where you talk through the what, how and why, over time you're equipping them with strategies which mean that they will be able to become more autonomous and independent. And what we've got to do is we've really got to use insightful formative assessment and checks for understanding to work out the intensity of the scaffolding, but also how long, because as we know it does have to be temporary, and it's also got to be flexible. I think as well it's one of those things where we've got to also look at it framed within a subject specific lens, which I think Rachel's done a lot of work on. So obviously you can have, your whole school teaching and learning principles which underpin what scaffolding is. But then actually, what does that mean within history, within maths, and really empowering your middle leaders so that they are driving that within the subject disciplinary lens, but also in primary in a phase specific way, because what we know is appropriate for year 5 and 6 might not be appropriate for year 1 and 2. And then again, when you translate that within year 1 and 2 history, what does that look like compared to year 5 and 6? So I think, a big part of scaffolding is making sure that whilst we've got a whole school understanding of it and a vision of it, it's how we work with it in a disciplinary frame of mind. I think some of the things that we sometimes see is, people will give kind of like a writing frame and be like, that's scaffolding, and they just expect the children to know what to do with it. So I think, that comes back to that modeling. And then if you've got a writing frame, it might be that some need a lot of support with that writing frame, whereas so it's really taking that on board. But I do think that we have a big challenge in terms of the kind of the death grips of differentiation. We were taught for so long that differentiation was the be all and end all, and it was introduced with the best intent with the research that was available at time. But unfortunately, it has become deeply embedded in schools, and it has lethally mutated. I've worked in a context where, there were tiered tasks, so challenge, hard challenge, extreme challenge, the chili challenge sort of situation. Where one kid would be doing a storyboard and one would be doing kind of extended writing. And then also tiered groups as well with tiered learning objectives. In one of the subjects at my school in RS, the 3 different groups were Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and they each had a different task. And there were 6 learning objectives, 2 per group. One was their objective and one was their kind of stretch objectives. So I think what we've got to be really mindful of is to learn the lessons of differentiation and really think about what scaffolding is and how it's different, but also as well try and step away from the evidence train. And I think that's where it could lead, and I know that will lead us on to a future kind of a question. But I think, this drive for stickers and worksheets and how are you going to evidence it? As Rachel said, the EEF said it can be verbal, visual, and written. And I certainly don't want verbal kind of verbal scaffolding stamps beginning to do the rounds.
At its heart, scaffolding is a part of differentiation, but it's the way that it's become so lethally mutated in the profession that I think that's why we've stopped using that word, because of what it's been associated with. David Didell calls it the dark art of differentiation. Margaret Mulholland talks about it's led to teachers juggling micro lessons, and I vividly remember, as you will as well, printing out 3 different worksheets, trying to like make them slightly more challenging each time, and then going, you do that worksheet and you do that one. And I think a big part of our book is about explaining the damage that does, low expectations, but then how scaffolding looks different, and it always starts with the challenge and then scaffold up, whereas I think differentiation a lot of time was about kind of looking down in terms of the support. And then there's the next challenge about trying to unpick what scaffolding actually looks like and the misconceptions around that, of which there are many. I think John Eaton wrote an absolutely brilliant blog about scaffolding's relation to kind of adaptive teaching, and that's where we've kind of got the idea of it involves what you do before the lesson. Then you've got your assessment for learning within the lesson to see, well, actually, are the students getting it? And if they're not getting it, that's where you bring in your scaffolding, some of which you might have pre-prepared, like you might have preempted in advance, but it's all about what do they actually need at this point, and then do they all need it? And then, like Alex said, do they even understand how then to use it as well? So it's really complex, and I think it's a topic that's not been hugely written about to this point. I think it's something we've talked about quite a lot, but I think there's still a lot of confusion about what it is.
If you go like galloping in and saying, okay, we're getting rid of differentiation and we're going to kind of go with kind of like scaffolding, it's kind of, everything we talk about de-implementation and kind of being careful with that, immediately staff will think it's another thing or it's going to be workload intensive. So I think really kind of, as Rachel said, having a clear definition of what it is and knowing what the misconceptions, almost like your scaffolding, your staff CPD launch of scaffolding, really thinking about what the misconceptions will be and the work that you're going to have to do before, during, and after when you're threading this through into your CPD and teaching and learning principles.
What really stands out to me there is the use of the word intensity, and that reducing the scaffold at some point. And one of the things that I've always got in my mind is that, mathematics being my sort of wheelhouse, quite often manipulatives can be used as a calculator or a surrogate calculator. And when the calculator is removed, there's no greater ability to engage with the mathematics than there might have been beforehand. Now, Alex, you said that scaffolding differs across phases and across disciplines. In your book, do you try and generalize the points at which teachers can begin to reduce the intensity of a scaffold? Or is that something that actually you probably couldn't generalize that because it is so specific?
I don't think you can, because it's so specific to every class and every time you teach it. And that's why there's no scaffolding without really, really good formative assessment for learning. Scaffolding just can't work, because you can't say in advance, well, we'll do these 3 questions and then actually I'll be able to remove that scaffold and I'll be able to do, because some students might not be, but you can't judge that until you're in the lesson. I think a really good analogy for that, I know he's talking about modelling specifically, but I think actually it can be widened. Tom Sherrington wrote this brilliant blog about modelling, where he described it as handing the baton over in a relay race. And he said, that within that whole moment where they hand the baton on, that actually, if you slow it right down, that might be a little bit of, take for example an I do, we do, you do. We might do it, I might show them a model, then we might do one together, and then I might think that the class is ready to do an independent example, and actually they're not. I might need to go back and show them another model. We might then need to do another we do. And I think it's all got to be that live unpacking in the lesson. As you become more experienced, you develop more expertise as a teacher, you might be able to judge in a better way at what point they might be ready. And the more times you teach something, I think, but I don't think you'll ever know completely, because it is all about that live assessment for learning.
I'm going to use history as an example because that's kind of what I understand. I wish I could come up with a maths example, but I really can't. But it's things like, you may provide when you're teaching about the Greeks, you'll provide kind of scaffolding, and it might be that you're doing source skills and interpretations. And so you'll provide that scaffolding, and then you'll begin to reduce that scaffolding over time for some students, obviously using your formative assessment. But then when you move into the Romans, well, actually that's new content. And even though you're sequencing and you're making those connections, actually there are new concepts, there's new vocabulary. And so actually what we've got to understand is that some subjects aren't always possible to have that kind of spiral, that actually, it does require that. And also, as you nudge through, if we look at the Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 2 history curriculum, in Key Stage 1, it's about being able to engage with a broad range of different kind of sources and begin to know their connection with historians. But when we get into lower Key Stage 2, it's actually being able to begin to support an inference from a source. And also to be able to really kind of talk about the relationship between historians and unpick those interpretations. So as your kind of curriculum elevates and kind of challenge as well, those scaffolds will need to be put into place at various different points. I think, you can always try and aim for certain things. So within our formative assessment of talk for writing, we try and look at how over the course of from EYFS, all the way up to year 6, we're trying to kind of remove the amount of scaffolds that a teacher provides in their feedback, so that by year 5 and 6, they are more autonomous and independent. But we also have that caveat in the policy, which is that actually for some children, you are still going to need to provide that because of X, Y, and Z. And I think it's about having that approach, as Rachel said, about knowing that actually it's bespoke to the context that you've got, but also, again, that subject disciplinary lens of it as well. So really trusting your middle leaders or subject leads in primary to know their subject and know kind of what scaffolding could look like, and how to kind of deploy it effectively.
It's almost reassuring if you're a teacher in that position and you think, well, there is no great generalization to work towards. So actually I can focus my attention on what I think effective teaching is making the most of every single moment and changing direction based on the information you receive. So I think that's really helpful.
Ties in quite nicely with what Quigley was saying though about professional failures, and that actually, along the course of kind of your teaching kind of program, you are going to kind of make those failures, and it's about kind of learning from them about how you can be more responsive and preempting those kind of misconceptions in scaffolding that you're going to be the next time. So, Adam Robbins, when he talks about middle leadership, he has like a curriculum snag list. And I think it's things like that where making a note each time across the department, kind of like, where did the snags come up? And was that common across the students, or was that bespoke to that particular class or student? And therefore kind of really thinking about then when you're doing your curriculum development during the hallowed time of gain time, how it is that you can make sure that you've got that kind of before work in place so that you've got that greater diet of things to consider when you look at the individual children within your class.
I think that's also a reason why we thought it was really important to put a chapter in our book that focuses particularly on practical subjects. Neither of us are practical teachers, and we found it difficult to think about scaffolding for those subjects. And so we've got some brilliant case studies coming from like PE, DT, music, drama, to really help us unpack what scaffolding might look like for teachers of those subjects.
We've got kind of sixth form and also primary as well, because for us it's about that authenticity of people who've lived and breathed it within the classroom.
That's fantastic. Sometimes the case studies can be my favorite part of the education books because you're thinking, oh, that's what it looks like. Now I understand. Now, we've already started to touch on this, but what are some of the pitfalls that teachers can fall into when trying to implement scaffolding?
One big pitfall is the kind of leadership pitfall, which I think Alex has already touched on a little bit. The idea that we want to improve teaching so much across our schools and that we know scaffolding is a really good thing. So we start doing things like saying that every lesson must include an I do, we do, you do, or you must have this kind of writing frame across all of your lessons. And that's the danger of thinking about a technique before a context. And we write about this in the book, that we can get so involved with learning about a particular scaffolding strategy that we forget that the content of the lesson must drive the actual strategy first. It's not about doing an I do, we do. It's looking at your lesson content and thinking, how can I scaffold this in the most effective way? But I think, unfortunately, for a lot of leaders, and they're doing it for good reason, they genuinely want to improve teaching, but they think that kind of enforcing a particular strategy is going to be the way to do that. And I think we challenge that in the book, and we say that it really is for a subject and even for a teacher to say, this is the best way to teach this content and to make it accessible and to scaffold it, not that the technique comes first. And for me, that's a huge lethal mutation that I worry about with scaffolding. Nothing's wrong with an I do, we do, you do, but it's not appropriate for every lesson or every subject. So that's one.
Yeah, I think building on what Rich was saying about leadership is, and what I said earlier about that, is that whole top-down approach. Obviously, it's having those overarching principles, but then also making sure that you're empowering the middle leaders and phase leaders to drive it within their individual context. And I think giving that time of kind of whole school disciplinary and personalized CPD time, and voluntary and non-voluntary, to really make sure that staff have got the time to research what that means within their own individual context, rather than just assuming that they can have one CPD on it and then, they're the masters of it. So really thinking about how you're going to sequence it and chunk it, because for some there is that kind of move away from differentiation and all those other things. I think quite often as well in our drive in a high accountability culture, as Rachel was saying, we can chase that kind of silver bullet. And it's that implementation which can often lead to, as Rachel said, lethal mutations, as Kate Joan talks about with the 7 retrieval myths, where everyone thinks that now you've got to start a lesson with retrieval, and as she says, it's the best way, but it's not the only way. So I think it's about how they can approach it with a tight but loose kind of focus on it, and really think about how it can be meaningfully embedded over time, weaving in with the other teaching and learning principles.
So I was just going to say, it reminds me of schools that, they latched onto Rosenstein's principles, for example, and then there are some schools who say that you've got to evidence all of Rosenstein's principles every lesson, and you think that no, that can't possibly happen, but you get leaders that are so desperate to kind of make change happen that they do that, and that's just our worry with scaffolding, I think. Sorry,
No, I think another thing can be that the curse of labels still hangs over. So we saw that differentiation where this is what you do for a dyslexic child, this is what you do for a disadvantaged child. What are you doing for your pupil premium? And my fear is that in some places it might just be, oh, how are you scaffolding for disadvantaged children? How are you scaffolding for dyslexic? Rather than seeing the child as an individual, but then also how you get that across to your teachers. That doesn't mean that you're planning for every single child in its absolute minutiae. So I think that's something, and also not using formative assessment, sticking to the plan, not adapting in that moment, or overly relying on scaffolds. So really not using that kind of responsive approach and thinking, okay, for this child, it's time to remove that. I have seen as well that it can be difficult. Say if we take reading as a concept, people think that, okay, reading, here are your scaffolds, but actually how you scaffold for independent reading and teacher-led modeled reading with reciprocal reading, there's some crossover between them. You use reciprocal reading in your teacher-led in the hope that when it comes to independent, they take on board those kind of strategies, but they are going to require different types of kind of scaffolding as you kind of introducing it. So I think, you can't say this is how we scaffold for reading, this is how we scaffold for writing. You've really got to think about what are the complexities of each of those different things.
I think you touched on it there, Alex, but I think also just the general pitfalls for a teacher of either leaving the scaffold up too long, because we want to support our teachers, our students as much as we can, give them the best chances, and then we don't let them have that independence and that challenge. We all thrive on challenge, and at some point it's the right thing to remove that scaffold. You can always put it back in if you need to, but I think letting the children be independent is so important. Or removing the scaffold too early and then the children floundering. And I think that's why it's so difficult. In fact, there was a survey done recently of teachers that said that like adaptive teaching and scaffolding is the thing that teachers are saying they find the hardest, because and therefore there needs to be really good CPD on it, because finding that sweet spot of when to remove the scaffolding is extremely challenging.
It's also remembering scaffolding isn't just in the classroom. Actually, you do have to scaffold homework. And so we've got a chapter on that, and scaffold independent learning. It's not, you can be like, hey, off you go and be an independent learner. We've really got to think about not only within the classroom, but beyond the classroom.
Mark Roberts also talks about the danger of the language around scaffolding. So it's really easy for us to go as teachers, stick your hands up if you're struggling and I will come over and give you some support. And he says, that can be really dangerous in the classroom, because so many students just won't want to put their hand up and admit that they're struggling. It's for you, the teacher, to do the assessment for learning and work out who needs the support, not for the students to put their hands up and go, I'm struggling. So I think that's another potential pitfall.
Do you reckon the MPQ updates have put a dent in the number of schools where these misconceptions are likely to be prevalent?
Yeah, and I do, but I also think the ECF has had an impact as well, because the ECF very clearly doesn't talk about differentiation, doesn't talk about predetermining. In fact, it says that that's bad. It actively talks about adaptive teaching and scaffolding principles within that. So I think that has had a big impact as well. But yeah, I facilitate the MPQ LTD, and we use some of these examples when we're facilitating it to talk about the lethal mutations you can get into as leaders and the danger of it, and what good leadership of teacher development looks like. And it's not this kind of very directive, you must do it in this way.
Yeah, and I think subject associations have played a big part in that, because you look at the geographical association, the historical association, and they're very much looking at scaffolding and how that could be woven within their CPD delivery. And to an extent, I hate to say it, but Ofsted has played a role in it as well. The more that they've been talking about kind of scaffolding, I think that has people becoming more aware of it. I think it is a shame about the future of the MPQs, because I think, as you said, that was beginning to have an impact and chip away at stuff. So the reduction in the suite that's going to be available for free, I think means that, we are going to have to think really cleverly about how we can continue to work on scaffolding in a way that's accessible to a broad range of people, and not have kind of a CPD gap or kind of like poverty oasis in terms of those who can access it and those who can't.
For me, I see it as you're feeding forward, because those middle leaders will be head teachers, primary certainly, maybe within the next decade. And then that's when we've got a workforce who are aware of how implementation can be done effectively. You know, I always talk about textbooks and the idea that the head teachers of today were forged in the time of textbooks being a dirty word in primary. So how on earth are they going to have the knowledge and understanding of getting the most from a high quality textbook? And so I'm almost seeing parallels between this and that, where, okay, these guys, they're middle leaders, they're sort of senior leaders moving towards headship. In 5-6 years' time, we'll see the benefit, I think, I hope. Because, like I said, there are still lots of instances where the things you describe are prevalent, and education leadership, you know, our kids deserve better, and our teachers deserve better, most importantly, I think. So how can we establish scaffolding as an effective part of our practice?
First of all, buy our book and we'll give you lots of ideas. No, I think the first thing to think about is the content of your lesson and the main teaching activities you use to teach that content. So as history teachers, Alex and I do a lot of reading, a lot of independent writing, a lot of looking at sources and unpicking sources, doing source skills. So those are our typical classroom activities. And from that point, I think then you can think about what are some of the main scaffolding approaches we might use. But then I think it is even diving even deeper than that and thinking about for each individual lesson, what's the content I need to teach that's going to be high pitched? And that should come obviously from your curriculum planning that you've done as a team or as a subject together. What scaffolding approaches can we then use that are going to ensure that all students have got the same access to the lesson? So we're starting with everyone learning the same curriculum, everyone's entitled to the same curriculum, but how can we then ensure that we scaffold up to support all learners? So like I said earlier, I think that the kind of before and during lesson approach, and after actually, is a really good way of thinking about it. So before the lesson, what are the barriers that I'm going to face? What are the potential misconceptions? Where might students struggle? At what point might they struggle to become independent? What strategies can I then put in place to scaffold? So could I have a glossary available? Could I have some sentence stems? Could I use some individual circulation around the class at certain points? Could I show them a great model? Could we do a we do together? Could I reduce the amount of content? You know, all of these things can be scaffolds. Do my assessment for learning and decide at that moment what particular scaffolding approaches are needed. And then afterwards, I think there is like a post-mortem that you need to do at the lesson, like Alex said, related to that snag list. What worked, what didn't, what might I need to go back and reteach? And again, looking at books is so vital. And I'm not saying marking because I think we talked previously about my feelings about marking. But you need to be looking at books in the same way you need to be circulating during your lesson. You need to be taking that feedback from all of your learners. So you need to be looking at books to see, well, what do I need to go back and reteach or do more modelling on, do more scaffolding on before I can then move on. So I think that approach, I think, is a really logical way of thinking about scaffolding that's needed. And then obviously on top of that, thinking about at what point I'm going to remove it and let there be that more independent, that chance for more independence.
For me, like the way that you make it most effective is you make sure that it aligns with your whole school teaching and learning policies and your curriculum as well, so that it's not kind of like a bolt on. It's not like a frog with a kind of Dolly Parton rodeo hat on. You don't understand why it's there and what it's doing. I don't know where that analogy's come from, but you can have that. But essentially, they've got to see it as part and parcel of it, as part of the kind of the cake mixture, if you like. That's probably a better one, because otherwise people will see it as a bolt-on. It's a thing that we are kind of adding on and in the lesson, rather than thinking, as Rachel said, integral to how are we scaffolding the curriculum to make sure that we are teaching to the top. How do we make sure that our teaching and learning practice means that we are being inclusive, and that we're using formative assessment really strongly to be able to adapt and be responsive to know when to remove those scaffolds and add those scaffolds. So it's even things like thinking about if you've been working, hard on your assessment and feedback policy, how are you scaffolding like feedback? How are you making sure that children are really clear about what their granular action step is, and not only what is it, how do you do it, and why are you doing that kind of improvement and feeding that forward? So I think it's really good to be interwoven, and whether that's, your rows and shines, you walk through, whatever it is that you've got in your school, is really thinking about that implementation and how you're going to make sure that staff see something where this is empowering their teaching practice rather than a distraction from. It's not that split attention sort of effect. And I think the best ways is kind of really modeling your CPD in a similar way to scaffolding. And I talked about that before. So doing your before, your during, and your afterwards. But within that process, really working in advance with those who are going to be driving it, listening to them during the process of that implementation and calibrating as you kind of go forward with that. Because I think a strong part of scaffolding is metacognitive oracy. I think the more that you're explaining kind of what you're doing, how you're doing it, and why you're doing it, and I think we've got to apply that to our CPD as well. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is how we can do it when we're looking at teaching and learning principles and curriculum. What might this look like in your subject, in your phase, and go away and have some time to really think about how you're going to how you're going to really powerfully implement that within your curriculum in a way that's going to be workload efficient but high impact. Um, and I think, Rachel's kind of talked about that after thing, how you're really going to measure the impact of that scaffolding that you're doing, so you can, learn lessons going forward.
I think that relates to what you said earlier about the lethal mutations of like evidencing scaffolding. I think it's really, really important that as leaders, we are looking at books. I think subject team booklets are a great idea. What are these books telling us as a team about maybe points in our curriculum, what we need to focus on more, but also teaching and learning wise as well. And as we said earlier, the point is not to evidence scaffolding, but you should be looking to see whether students are making good progress, answering incomplete complete questions. If you've got work that's incomplete, if there's misconceptions, if there's poor structuring of answers, all of those things will indicate that more scaffolding needs to happen. So I think that's a really key part of any implementation, is making sure that you just are revisiting those books. But it's not about evidencing the scaffolding, and it's not about leaders looking for scaffolding in books. It's about looking for progress in the best way that you can in a book. Obviously we can't see learning, but there are indicators that will tell us whether students are learning, and that's
and I
why
think that links to quality assurance as well. And I'm loath to use the word quality assurance, but if your observations, your learning walks, it's about being mindful that you might not physically see scaffolding, like when you go, like how a mathematician scaffolds, how a music teacher scaffolds. And that's why you've really got to ensure that you're having those curriculum conversations where they can tell you what the scaffolding is and how they've planned for that and what they've been doing, that those beautiful invisible moments where they're making magic happen. And you're watching a magician in play. There's awe and wonder going on. You're not quite sure how that's happening, but it's happening. And speaking to the children and seeing how that kind of might be echoed in books. It won't always be echoed because we know some of it's verbal. And so we might not see that actually that scaffold that teaching gave through like a verbal nudge is what led to that beauty in the work. So I think, as part of the, I hate to say it, quality assurance process, it's how you're unpicking how scaffolding is being implemented in your school in a really rounded, triangulated way that isn't evidence for the sake of evidence.
Yeah, I once had a maths lead who said to me, anyone who uses evidence as a verb is getting a wide berth. Well, maybe
I
not as
like
polite as that.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard I've heard one school where they're going to get I do, we do, you do stickers, and every time that you provide a model to a SEND student, you have to stick it in their book. So there's some really horrendous stuff out there, and it's about how we just, as Mary Myatt says, that we're humans first and professionals second. Just being a little bit common sense with this.
So you guys won't be giving away scaffolding stamps with your book.
Now there's an idea.
Yeah, it's tempting. Or maybe we just get a stamp that says, if you are doing this, you need to be avoided, and then you can just stamp people who are insisting on it.
It's really clear how this is almost, it exists in an ecosystem of effective practice within school. Do like almost teachers who are islands within their own schools? do they stand a chance at of scaffolding effectively, or is it's possible, but it's just going to be a lot more work if it doesn't feed into everything else that the school is doing?
See, the thing is with scaffolding that I think actually there's lots of great practice out there that teachers are already using that they probably might not recognize to be scaffolding. So I don't think that those teachers are without a chance. I think that there's lots of approaches they're probably using or know about. You know, we've done modeling since day dot, I think, as teachers. We maybe haven't always been as effective about it as we could be. We maybe haven't broken it down as much as we've needed to for students. You know, we've all done verbal nudges as we walk around the classroom, reminded students how to start, or what points they need to make in their answer. But I think it's about doing it in a more meaningful way, and just thinking about it in a little bit more, thinking about it a little bit more deeply, and then ultimately thinking more about removing it. I think there's lots and lots of good practice that already exists that comes under that scaffolding umbrella. And I do think there's loads of CPD that even a teacher on their own school can tap into to get support around it.
Yeah, I think as Rachel said, for a long time people have been quacking like a duck and walking like a duck, but not been calling it a duck. So, people have been scaffolding. It's just that it's a new term, and it's kind of like a couple of years ago when adaptive teaching came in, and you can see people like, oh, it's another term. And, so actually it's about really thinking about what are the effective ways of doing teaching and learning, and how is that actually already sitting underneath the umbrella of scaffolding. So that again, it for those who perhaps are more reticent or kind of concerned about it, they can see that actually scaffolding isn't something to be afraid of. It's something which is actually already taking place, and it just needs those kind of tweaks. And
Yeah.
I think it's Rach says, you can be in a bit of a you can end up in some context where you can feel you're in a bit of a silo, and it's potentially not whole school policy, or that not everyone's doing that. But I think that's where you reach out to your subject associations, or you kind of there's so many books like our own which will be coming out soon, and CPD, and going to events like Research Ed, and just thinking about that tide might not be flowing in my school in that way, but this is what I'm reading, and this is what the evidence is suggesting, and within my context, this is what's right for my children, so I'm going to give it a go. And when people feel confident to share that within their own context and help to turn that tide.
I think also there are like some really quick, easy wins that don't take huge amounts of planning. So I was thinking about scaffolding of retrieval practice. And I think that's something actually a lot of teachers don't scaffold, but actually it's really quick and easy. So when you're setting your retrieval practice, the first thing we'd say is don't rush in to give your scaffold, because students need that challenge. Retrieval practice is hard, and we need to allow them to feel that moment. It's a desirable difficulty. It's something that they need to work at. But then just something as simple as giving a hint is scaffolding. So let's have a look at question 1. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a hint there if you're struggling, or maybe not if you're struggling. Maybe use better terminology than that. And then, it might be, let's do number 1 together, and then I'll leave you to do the rest independently. That's scaffolding. Now that is all live in the lesson. You don't need to do any pre-planning. It's really quick, easy win. There's no reason why any teacher can't quickly just start using that kind of scaffolding. I think there are other examples like that. When you're doing reading, like I said earlier, read through the text beforehand, think about the words that students might struggle with, think where you're going to pause and you're going to question, take 15 minutes before your lesson, and you've done that. So yes, I think it perhaps comes across sometimes like it's this huge, scary thing. And actually, if you break it down lesson by lesson, topic by topic, it's perhaps not as scary.
I think that's fantastic. I mean, I think a lot of our listeners will, certainly quite a few of them have taken the red pill, but they're the only one in school who's taken the red pill so far, and it just takes a few more to come on board. I think I'll be really reassuring for them. I like the example of retrieval practice, because obviously there's the whole queuing idea, and I always get asked about how much do we want them to feel during retrieval, and there's that balance. But like you say, if you're modeling one and then okay, have a go at the rest and that kind of thing, you can easily bring lots more of the pupils on board with you. That's fantastic. I mean, do you guys have a hard deadline for your publication, or for when you're going to have the book submitted?
So deadline for us is October. So we're looking at, I don't know, some point next year, basically, for publication. Yeah.
I'm very excited.
Yeah, the hope is that there'll be some learning modules that go alongside it. So if you like the book, then also listen to us and our dulcet tones talking all about it.
Yeah, a bit of a plug for Inner Drive, who are editing the book series. They have a Teacher CPD Academy, so we'll be doing a module for that. Yeah.
Nice. Well, if you need anyone to read it, the early drafts or whatever, or write, the nice little sentence in the back of the book, just send it
We
my way.
will definitely take you up on that. Thank you.
I love reading these books, so the more I can. And like I said, talking to you guys tonight, I'm thinking, oh no, next year's really far away.
I know. I have to say, like, it's really hard writing a book. And I think there's lots of perhaps perception that either people just write it really quickly or they just find it really easy. I have to say both of us have had lots of moments where we've gone, what are we doing? Who are we to write about this book? How can we do this? So it is definitely a challenge, and I think, like, mentally as well as physically finding the time to write, it's all about overcoming your own demons, I think, sometimes. But yeah, I'm really proud of what we've written so far, and yeah, just a few bits to finish off, get all the case studies together, but we're getting there.
I will choose anything other than what I'm supposed to be doing sometimes. If it's a long project, like writing something that's above 20,000 words, whatever, I'll watch Coronation Street. I'm like, I don't watch Coronation Street, but let's just sit and let's not do what I'm supposed to be doing right now. So,
Yeah, I think mine was a big delay in starting, and then I absolutely took Peps McRae's advice to like the nth degree, which is write drunk and edit sober, but I've not yet done the editing. So the reading chapter's already at 12,000 words, and so there's going to have to be a lot of sober editing going.
That's the fun part. Fantastic. Well, it's been lovely chatting with you guys. Hopefully, you'll join me maybe when the book is published and if I have a read and there's anything else. But I think you've done a really good job of summarizing sort of almost the key things that teachers can focus their attention on. All I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you for having us in this opportunity.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.